It is 1829. A man named Green DeWitt stands at the edge of a vast, empty plain in what is technically the Republic of Mexico. The grass stretches to the horizon. There are no roads, no towns, no neighbors for 100 miles. In his pocket is a document, a land grant signed by the Mexican government giving him permission to settle 300 American families on this land. 300 families on land that belongs to a foreign country, a country that speaks a different language, practices a different religion, and operates under a completely different legal system than anything these settlers have ever known. The question is, why would Mexico want them here? And why would 30,000 Americans say yes? Welcome to the Western Ledger, where we dig into the stories behind the history you thought you knew. I'm Lamar. I'm the producer and narrator in today's episode, which marks the start of a series that covers one of the most dramatic, consequential, and misunderstood chapters in American history, the settlement of Texas. You'll understand why Mexico opened its doors to American settlers, why that decision was arguably the biggest political miscalculation in Mexican history, and how it set off a chain of events that would ultimately reshape the map of North America. Let's go back to the beginning. In 1820, the territory of Texas was enormous, wild, and nearly empty. It had been claimed by Spain for centuries, and when Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, Texas came with the deal. But claiming land and actually controlling it are two very different things. The problem was people, or rather, the lack of them. The entire province of Texas had fewer than 4,000 non-native settlers. That's fewer people than a small town today, spread across an area roughly the size of France. And Texas was not empty in the way the Mexican government pretended it was. The Comanche, arguably the most powerful military force on the southern plains, controlled vast stretches of it. They raided settlements, drove off livestock, and made large parts of Texas functionally ungovernable. Mexico City was 1,200 miles away. Communication took weeks. Military protection was essentially non-existent. So Mexico faced a dilemma that governments have faced throughout history. How do you hold territory you can't populate or protect? Their answer was radical and, in hindsight, fatally short-sighted. They would invite Americans to move to Texas. The plan was called the empresario system, and it was actually a Spanish colonial idea that Mexico inherited and adapted. Here's how it worked. The Mexican government would grant a contract to a trusted individual, an empresario, giving him the right to recruit and settle a specific number of families in a designated area of Texas. In return, the empresario got a large land bonus. The settlers got land too, far more than they could ever afford in the United States. And the land was extraordinary. Rich black soil in the river valleys, mild winters compared to the American Midwest, perfect for cotton farming. The timing was also perfect, for the Americans at least. The United States in the 1820s was in economic turmoil. A financial panic in 1819 had wiped out farmers and speculators across the South and Southwest. Men who had borrowed heavily to buy land found themselves bankrupt, with creditors hunting them down. In Texas, there were no creditors, no debt collectors, no past catching up with you. There was even a dark joke among Americans heading to Texas. When someone disappeared suddenly, fleeing debts, a scandal, or a failed marriage, people would say they'd gone to Texas and leave it at that. The first and most important impresario was a man named Moses Austin, and then Stephen F. Austin was 27 years old when he inherited his father's contract. He was educated, diplomatic, and spoke enough Spanish to navigate Mexican bureaucracy. He would spend the next 15 years of his life building something that had never existed before, an American colony inside a foreign nation. By 1825, Austin's colony had over 1,800 settlers. By 1830, Texas had more American settlers than Mexican citizens, and by 1835, just 15 years after the empresario system began, there were roughly 35,000 Americans in Texas against fewer than 8,000 Tejanos, as the Mexican Texans were called. Mexico had solved its population problem and created a much bigger one. The settlers hadn't arrived without conditions. Mexico wasn't naive, at least not entirely. To receive land, American settlers had to agree to several requirements. They had to become Mexican citizens. They had to convert to Catholicism, or at least claim to. They had to learn Spanish, and critically, they had to obey Mexican law, including Mexican law on slavery. This last point was a powder keg from the very beginning. Mexico had been moving toward abolishing slavery since independence. In 1829, President Guerrero issued a full emancipation decree. American settlers in Texas, many of them from the American South, many of them bringing enslaved people with them to work their cotton farms, were furious. Texas was granted a temporary exemption, but the tension never went. And slavery wasn't the only fracture point. The settlers chafed under a legal system built on Spanish civil law rather than English common law. Trial by jury didn't exist. Land disputes were handled by officials hundreds of miles away who didn't speak English. The Catholic conversion requirement was mostly ignored. American Protestant churches quietly took root across the settlements. And as the American population grew and grew and grew, the settlers began to feel less like guests in a foreign country and more like a majority waiting to assert it. In 1830, alarmed by what it was seeing, the Mexican government passed the law of April 6th, dramatically restricting further American immigration to Texas, prohibiting the import of enslaved people, and increasing customs enforcement along the border. It was too late. The Americans were already there. What followed over the next 5 years was a slow, grinding escalation, the kind of conflict where both sides feel provoked, both sides feel wronged, and neither side can find a way to step back from the edge. Stephen Austin, who had spent 15 years urging moderation and working within the Mexican system, made one final attempt at compromise. In 1833, he traveled to Mexico City to petition for Texas to become a separate Mexican state, still part of Mexico, but with its own government and greater, tougher autonomy. He waited months for an audience with President Santa Anna. When he finally got one, Santa Anna seemed receptive. Austin, cautiously optimistic, wrote a letter back to Texas settlers suggesting they move ahead with forming a state government without waiting for formal approval. That letter was intercepted by Mexican officials. Austin was arrested for sedition. He spent 18 months in a Mexican prison, much of it in solitary confinement. When he was finally released and returned to Texas in 1835, the man who had spent his entire adult life preaching patience and accommodation was done. In one of the most remarkable personal transformations in American history, Stephen F. Austin, the man who built Texas through diplomacy, became one of the loudest voices calling for revolution. He said simply, "War is our only resource." And within weeks, it began. The Texas Revolution would last 7 months. It would produce some of the most dramatic and debated moments in American history. The Siege of the Alamo, the massacre at Goliad, and Sam Houston's decisive victory at San Jacinto. But none of it would have been possible without those first settlers, the men and women who loaded their wagons and crossed into a foreign country, chasing the promise of land and a fresh start. They didn't set out to change history. Most of them just wanted good soil and a new beginning. What they got was something else entirely. If you want to follow this story all the way through, from the first settlers to the Revolution to the Republic of Texas, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. Next time we go deep on the man who made it all possible, Stephen F. Austin, his life, his vision, and the sacrifices he made to build something that ultimately consumed him.